Welcome back to The Open Road, a video series in which my friend Brian and myself are trying to wax eloquent about various things around open source community. In our previous episode, we should do intros first, right? All right.
Probably.
I'm Rich Bowen. I am the community architect for the CentOS project, working in the open source program office at Red Hat.
And I am Brian Proffitt, manager of the Community Insights team with the Red Hat Open Source Program Office. And thank you all for coming back and watching as we progress through this journey down the open road, especially around onboarding. So this next series, I'm really excited about because we're talking about like that age-old question about how much do we assume people know when they come in to any given project?
This is going to vary a great deal depending on the size of the project, the maturity of the project, and the nature of your contributors. And so we talked to several individuals about their experience in onboarding people and what they assume up front about what their onboardees already know. Two of these interviewees you've already met in our previous episode, and the third one we'll introduce when we come to him.
Yeah. So kicking off, we asked this question to Deb Nicholson, who is currently the acting general manager of the Open Source Initiative and a longtime friend of the show. And we put the question to her fairly directly. When somebody's coming on board, how much knowledge do you assume that they know? And then how do you work with that? So here's what she had to say.
Yeah, so basically, I think if people want to help with something that you do need help with, then for me, that is enough of a starting point. So if they are like the mismatch comes when they have overestimated their readiness and you have to do some things. I don't assume base knowledge, but I do a lot of when I first did this task, one of the things that I got stuck on or stumbled on or or totally messed up was this. Have you hit something like that yet? And then I can kind of get a sense of like how much they've done without being like, are you noob or no? It's like, is this thing new to you? Okay.
Right.
Because it's people are coming, I think, more and more into open source from all different places and all different backgrounds, and there's not like one true Linux kernel mailing list that like everyone has as a touchstone, which is great. I think we have lots of people helping on lots of different things, and so so I try to like and if we're talking about like, well, what tasks do you want to work on? I'll say like, tell me about like things that you've already done and things that you're interested in getting out of volunteering here. And so, if you only have one, then you might like, I worked at a nonprofit and someone volunteered to do all of the finances and budgeting and bookkeeping because they had done it, but no one asked them if they wanted to do it really. Like, so they ended up really not like, I'll tell you what, almost nobody wants to do bookkeeping as a volunteer.
So true.
It's but then if you ask people like, what do you want to? I'm gonna keep a note of that, and next time you need a volunteer bookkeeper, I will call you, Brian.
All right.
But if you ask people what they want to get out of it, then people might say like, oh, I want to meet more folks, and it's like, well, great. Like, one of the things that we don't have is like interviews on our blog with people doing like different pieces of the work. So that would be a great way for you to meet people in the project. And they're like, oh yeah, okay. Or if it's something else, they're like, oh, I really just want to like put some stuff on my resume so I can get a really cool open source job in 2 years when I graduate. Then what you assign them and how you term it and frame it and scope it is a lot different.
Yeah.
Because
Yeah,
it's,
that's
I mean,
yeah. Because your example is right on the mark. That happened to me. Like anytime, my wife and I would attend a new church or something like that, invariably it would come up, what I do, and
You're the computer guy.
I'm the computer guy, or I'm the website guy, and then all of a sudden I find myself getting tasked to work on that organization's website or something like that, and I was just like, I was actually coming here for other reasons. So, but so I understand that example perfectly, and that's certainly a tricky thing to do.
Well, you can also manage up. You don't have to just tell everyone what you're good at. Like you can say like, one of the things that I'm really excited about is like I've never worked on a capital campaign, or I've never done like or I feel like I don't know enough people in the community, and I heard that you didn't have much of a newcomers committee at this parish. Like, could I help with that? So, so really trying to find a way to align volunteers' interests in like what they want to get out of it with like something that can be useful for you. And it might not be something you thought of before, you know. Like in that example of a parish with a newcomers committee, if you don't have one, then you might not know that a lot of other parishes have them. And it's like my parents do that at their church. It's one of the things they do.
Yeah.
And it's, and they love it. They find it really rewarding. They used to go to restaurants with people. They don't do that now because of the pandemic, but they had like this monthly restaurant night and it was super fun.
Well,
so the first thing I really notice about that clip is how bad the focus is in almost every shot.
It really is. And also, just so you know, the running joke with this is these desperate attempts for continuity between clips. And Rich and I have changed our hairstyles. Things behind us keep changing. So we'll probably have a prize at the end of the series if you can name what's different in each podcast. So stay tuned for that. In the meantime, I think I like that clip. Besides revealing my forbidden love for spreadsheets, which, that's a little awkward. I do like the fact that Deb is very good about, basically targeting what the person wants to do versus what they're good at.
That was the biggest thing that I pulled out as well.
Yeah. And it's good because we've all been there, especially in the technology community. You say that you work in computers or software, IT or whatever, and immediately, boom, you're the computer person.
Can you fix my printer?
Exactly. No. And, no, I can't fix your printer because no one can fix your printer. That's impossible. And nor do I really want to.
The other thing that I pulled out of this is that Deb is more compassionate than many people. Her approach, she talked about this right at the beginning, where rather than saying, "Are you clueless?" She relates her own stories. This is where I got stuck on this. And I, since we did this interview, I found myself very intentionally doing that. People have. I had a meeting yesterday where somebody was trying to learn a new skill, and my approach to it was, well, here are the things that I got hung up on when I did that. Rather than saying to them, okay, what are you having trouble with? What don't you understand? Because they had no basis for saying what they didn't understand because they didn't understand any of it. And so this has become a very intentional part of my repertoire, you might say. So I've really appreciated just thinking back over this interview.
Yeah. No, that's great. I like that approach. That I do something similar, like when I meet somebody new and I'm trying to explain background information. The bad way of doing it is to just assume they know nothing and then just do an information dump.
Yeah.
But what I try to do is the opposite and say, how much do you know so I don't completely bore you? So the assumption is flipped. I assume they know some or all of what I'm about to say. And then if they don't, then I can go ahead and and scale the conversation in that direction.
There's a bit of a pitfall that can happen there, though, if people don't know anything but don't want to appear stupid, right? And if you go into it assuming that they know anything at all, then of course the other side of that is if you go into it assuming that they know nothing at all, some people are insulted by that. So it's a bit of a balancing act.
Right. Yeah. And I'm trying to avoid the latter. So, but you're right. It's not a perfect solution. So I think I'm going to take the information from, the approach rather that you and Deb are doing and maybe try to apply that. So that's cool.
One other thing that I noticed from this was the emphasis on understanding what they're trying to get out of the experience. And this is something that I've encountered in my work with the Apache Software Foundation. We set up a website that allowed projects to list things that they wanted people to do. And overwhelmingly, people would come to that list and they'd pick something, and trying to think how to phrase this. A lot of the people that came looking for something to do were looking for resume builders. They were looking for they wanted to check the open source box on their resume, and they didn't have any clear idea of what they wanted to get out of it other than that checkbox. And that's a challenging thing when people don't have a particular interest other than, I was told by my professor I should do open source stuff.
Right. And I think, so that's where the honest comes back to us as community managers and community architects, because, we're going to have to put in a little bit of effort, I think, around what are your intentions, what are your skills, and intention and goals probably wrap up together, but you can even have that as a conversation too. And be deliberative about it. And I think that's something a lot of us don't do. I don't do that very often, especially when I'm working on a new project where it's like, you're casting a huge wide net and you're trying to get as many contributors or users or both as possible. So yeah, tailoring that conversation, I think, is an important thing that Deb has brought up.
So the next clip that we have is, again, from Mary Thengvall.
Mary Thengvall, who has worked with us at Red Hat at one time, doing fantastic work. Right now, she's the director of developer relations at Carmunda. So we posed the assumption of knowledge question to her, and here's what she had to say.
The more that I engage with global communities, the more that I realize I can't assume anything. And that's been an interesting learning curve for me, especially this year. My company that I work for is primarily based out of Germany. We have teammates all over the world. And so kind of learning, people don't know the turn of phrase that I just used. They don't know the weird random word that I used, or why I'm intentionally mispronouncing something, because that's the inside joke, right? And so there's all of that goes into it. And I think for me, even as someone who, I'm a part of a lot of communities, I'm a part of a lot of different kinds of communities. I've read a lot of onboarding docs. I always appreciate the ones that are more thorough, because I can always choose to skim through them and skip over pieces that I think I know. But for people who don't know things, this might be their first community. This might be their first time on that platform. This might be the first time that they've ever engaged with people in this type of an environment online. I don't know. I don't know their background. And so I think between, events going virtual this year and so many more platforms being out there and platforms changing, communities growing and everything else, I've learned even more this year that you have to be almost too informative or border on what we think might be too informative in that onboarding doc in order to make sure that no one feels left out or feels like they have gaps in their knowledge when they're joining.
So how do you ride the balance between that and people saying, "Are you calling me stupid? I already knew that." That's something I've struggled with when I've tried to be too descriptive.
It's fair. That's fair. I think if it's a document that you're working on, a living document that you're writing on, including a line at the top that says something along the lines of, hey, this is a global community. We welcome anyone of any skill level, any background, any location. As a result, there may be things in this onboarding doc that you already know, but we want to make sure that everyone feels welcome, everyone feels included, everyone feels like they are starting off on the same foot as far as what they're aware of, what they know, how to access all of the right information. And that tends to kind of reset people's expectations, where if I read something like that, I'll go, oh, okay, I'll probably skim most of the doc. But I'm not going to be getting halfway through going, someone really thought I needed to read this. I'm so offended.
Yeah.
So definitely, Mary emphasizes something that, we got from Deb, is that there's got to be intentionality around making sure that your onboarding process is as inclusive as possible. And I liked how she touched on everything from, base knowledge to something that we're going to be talking about later in this series, which is, cultural aspects and inside jokes.
The inside jokes, yeah.
We're going to get there, because that's something that's really gives us a lot of thinking to do. But yeah, I like her approach. Mary is always very methodical and complete, and that certainly shows up in her answer.
So I also liked that she focused on, it's funny, the first thing that I say in that clip is tabula rasa. And, she kind of latched onto that. Maybe your audience doesn't know colloquialisms. Maybe they don't know the particular phrase that you used. And I have found, so I'm involved in a project at work right now that is acronym heavy. And everybody assumes that you know what all the acronyms mean. And I don't know any of them. And during every meeting, I find myself frantically writing down the acronyms and going and looking them up so that I don't look uninformed. But it would be helpful if this project came with a glossary. And, one of the things that Mary focuses on in this clip is that when you have a written document, it gives you the option to be more exhaustive without, and then people that already know stuff can skip the stuff that they already know.
Yeah, that I think that a glossary as I can hear people turning up their noses about that. It's like, oh, how pedantic. I think that is actually something that a lot of communities could benefit from, especially ones that are very large or very mature or both, because there is so much insider knowledge going on. I'm involved in a non-software community that has a huge amount of inside terminology and slang and acronyms. And they have a glossary for people like me who are just trying to figure out, okay, what is this person talking about? So it's helpful.
And you can really get hung up on that. If you're in a conversation and somebody uses jargon or an acronym, that can derail your mind to the point where you miss the rest of it. I was in a meeting earlier this week. As you can tell, I attend a lot of meetings. I was in a meeting earlier this week where I introduced myself as being part of the OSPO. And for the first few minutes of the call, the person that I was talking to didn't know what OSPO was. It's the Open Source Program Office, for those of you listening. But that had derailed them to the point where we had to reset. We had to go back and start all over again because they had been trying to figure out what I had said from that moment.
Yeah, it happens a lot. It happens when, we're meeting with people, like Mary. We work in a very global situation. Even members of our own team are scattered all across the planet, and that's just our own team, let alone the rest of the company and all the other corporations and organizations we deal with. And so I find myself, the personal struggle I have is trying to dial back the idioms, because I use them a lot. I grew up in the Midwest. I hope what is a direct way of talking, and therefore I'm just going to throw out idioms to get my point across. And when I am engaging with global audiences or individuals, it really is an effort to not fall back on those patterns. And I think that is an intentionality that a lot of community architects should be doing, and not assume that they know what, things like dial back mean, or inside baseball, or, whatever you're going to throw out there.
The third clip that we're going to show you was part of a discussion that we had with Mark Collier, who is the COO of the what's the
blooper reel. So Mark Collier he's the COO of the Open Infra Foundation.
Right, and they changed their name just recently, and so I had a bit of a brain cramp there. Mark was somebody that I knew back from the days when I was working with the OpenStack project. And we phrased the question a little bit differently with Mark, because OpenStack was and is a strange beast in that almost everyone that works on it is a professional software developer rather than a nights and weekends volunteer open source developer. So here's the conversation that we had with Mark.
That's a good question. I'm not sure if I know for sure. I mean, I feel that the initial set of developers were mostly people that were familiar with open source. Like I said, coming out of Canonical experience, MySQL communities, those were some of the early contributors, as well as the folks from ANSO Labs, which were that worked with NASA. That ultimately they were part of the creation of it. So Jesse Andrews, Josh McKenty, they all had various backgrounds in different browser open, the open web and JavaScript and things like that. So I think most of the people early on had open source experience in different ways. However, I would say that what was really cool, in my opinion, and maybe somewhat unique, is that we were, in my background, coming as a business person and used to building ecosystems by bringing lots of companies together. I think we were able to kind of make it okay for people to get paid, and for corporate companies to get involved. We didn't sort of have this schism of saying, okay, it's open source, so you can't make money, or it's all for profit. Right. It was kind of like, let's build a big enough tent. And so you had companies like Dell and Cisco and others getting involved, and maybe some of in NTT. There's some early companies where I think some of the developers were interested and curious about doing more development in the open, but maybe didn't have a ton of background in that. Their company didn't have the culture for that. So I think that we actually have had some success in the early days, and continuing on with kind of creating more of a acceptable investment from these companies in hiring upstream developers. I think that was a success story in that regard.
So that clip is very different from what it's sort of a different emphasis from the other clips that we showed you a moment ago. And we were talking about the difference in base knowledge between people that are steeped in open source already and those that have been hired to do a job.
Right.
So I'm not even sure that this fits in with the rest of the interview.
But I think it can, because this is a thing that, you and I run into this all the time. And I think other community architects and people who are getting into the open source community are still running into, because there is a lot more involvement from corporations now in open source. And that transition, this is part of onboarding too, getting people who are paid to do a job, contributors of all stripes, designers, developers, whatever, engaged in open source. Because that's a big mindset change.
It is.
And so they probably have the technical knowledge already. That's not the issue. Now it becomes a cultural issue.
Yeah.
And a process issue. We had this. Oh, go ahead.
Well, going back to what Deb said about trying to figure out what their motivation is. When you ask somebody what your motivation is and they say, well, my boss told me to do this, you're right. It's a very different mindset from somebody that comes in with the passionate desire to be engaged in a community. And some of these people, my experience with OpenStack was that the cultural adaptation to open source was very, very complete. A lot of these people really embraced the mindset. But then there were the people that were punching the time card, and they didn't want to do all this fluffy community stuff. They just wanted to do their job and go home. And that's okay too, right? I mean, it's your job, and that's honorable as well.
Right. And we see that on the volunteer side too. There are people who are just like, that is a bug. I'm going to fix it. I'm going to kill it until it is dead. And then they throw in the patch, and any kind of conversation or accolades or any kind of follow-up like that, sometimes they can just be gone. They ghost and they're out of the picture altogether.
Which is fine. Everybody's got different motivations. And I think that's probably what I got out of this clip is respecting people's motivations and, letting them be who they are. Yeah.
I tend to be a little bit biased, and I'll admit this, against the business aspects of, people coming into open source, because for me, I'm a very big believer in the collaboration and the altruism. And that is not to say that the corporate mentality or the profit side mentality is bad. It's just that, I lean towards another direction.
Yeah.
That said, it's always fascinating to me to see the transition for developers who are getting paid. They've been working on software for a long time, probably in a proprietary context, and watch them shift over. And it isn't even the processes sometimes. Sometimes it's really about the level of collaboration. An anecdote that I tell is right after I joined Red Hat, I met with a team in another office in another country. I was talking to them. We were getting things going. There was a lot of dialogue. And one of the junior developers spoke up with an idea, and it was a great idea. And I knew they could do it because they clearly had thought this through. And I said in the meeting, you should do that. That's, because it's part of being in an open source community. And I wasn't like dumping a huge amount of work on them, but it was just clearly something that they could do. And they looked at me and they looked at their manager down the table, and then they basically said, well, no, that's not really my place. And you can imagine I didn't react well to that, but I was a guest, so I behaved. But I did, and fortunately the manager agreed with me, and they were very astute about open source practices and collaboration. And we reassured the developer that, yes, it is appropriate. There is no hierarchical structure here. If you've got an idea, you take it and you run with it, and you get help if you need it and go from there.
So that calls out an interesting point, that onboarding is not just for individuals, it's also for organizations. When a company gets involved in open source for the first time, it can be a real culture shock. If you were dealing in that scenario with a company with a manager that wasn't familiar with open source, that didn't embrace it, that can be a real clash. And working with the incubator at the Apache Software Foundation, I've seen this a number of times where a developer would come to an open source project and it was clear that their management wasn't on board with this notion. And or even more excitingly, if two people from an organization are in an open source project trying to respect their hierarchy, where it doesn't apply in the open source project. So, that's something I guess we didn't talk about with any of our interviewees, but onboarding a manager, onboarding a company into an open source project can be really challenging to get them to understand that they no longer own everything and that it's owned by the collaborative community.
Right. And we've seen this time and time again. Individual contributor will be promoted within the project. They will get to maintainer status or senior maintainer, however the hierarchy in the project is, and they can find themselves in a position where they have more influence on the technical direction of the project than their own management.
Yeah.
And that's okay, but you're right. I've seen some managers here and there who are just sort of get a little bit, shaky about that.
Yeah.
And, you just have to say, look, calm down. It's fine. Your job is to make your life easy, make life easier for your team. But that's just me. So, yeah. But good. I think so. Yeah. Getting back to your original point, I think that this does fit. But yes, Mark is talking about things on a bigger scale, the corporate scale, which is still, as you say, part of onboarding.
So that's what we have for this episode, and we appreciate you all listening. We look forward to hearing your thoughts about these things, because everybody's experience with onboarding is very personal and unique. And we look forward to sharing with you the next part of these interviews.
All right. So until then, thanks again for watching this episode of The Open Road. My name is Brian Proffitt.
And I'm Rich Bowen.
Have a great and safe day.